Hi, everybody. Welcome to panel 2 of Higher Ed. This one is from Classroom to the Boardroom, Institutional Racism in the Ivory Institution. I'm really excited about this particular panel. Over the past few weeks, I've just met some of the coolest people who are passionate about what they do. And I felt like I really resonated with a lot of these folks that are coming up on the panel. But before that, so my name, should do that. My name is Eric Stevens. I'm the founder of this initiative, the movement, hashtag Higher Ed. Currently in the DC, Baltimore area, living in my childhood basement bedroom turned storage unit turned office because of my displacement from COVID and employment, all that kind of stuff, which is why I started all of this. And it's come to the point where it's enough people have shown interest that I can start inviting people to have engaging conversations. And that's what I hope to do with all of these panels and with the workshops that we have going. So today we're going to be joined by Dr. Brittany Robertson, Liz Leiba, and Niatu Bentsi-Enchill. And I think that we're going to have a great conversation. I really do. So I'm going to bring each of them up, and they're going to take a minute to introduce themselves, the way the panel is going to work. Excuse me. The way we're going to work, they're going to come up on the screen, give themselves a little bit of an introduction, specifically like what is their role in higher ed and their history with higher education. And then we have some questions that we've talked about together as a group that we've discussed. And then we're going to hopefully take some questions from the audience as well. So if you have questions, please make a comment. I'll be searching through those and seeing where we go. So right here, first we have Dr. Brittany Robertson, we have Liz Leiba, and we have Niatu. Please take a moment to introduce yourselves. I'm going to jump off screen and we'll go from there. And I'll throw up that question that we have to get us all started.
All right, thank you, Eric. So I'll go first. My name is Dr. Brittany Robertson. I've worked in higher education in the areas of residential life, recruitment, admissions for almost 6 years. And I recently defended my dissertation research at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. My research focuses on, thank you very much. It focuses on Black women, so focusing on intersectionality and experiences of people whose identities intersect and have marginalized identities, and their experiences in the workplace, particularly higher education. So my dissertation focused on Black women staff in higher education and their perceptions of organizational culture. So that's a lot of what I research and I'm very interested in. So thank you for coming, and I look forward to this conversation.
Awesome. My name is Elizabeth Leiba. I currently work as an instructional designer, and I've been doing that for the past 6 years. I entered higher education about 20 years ago. I first started in higher ed as an admissions counselor. So initially I worked on the admissions side, did that on and off for about 10 years, and then 10 years ago, I became a faculty member. So I've been a faculty member at various private and public institutions for the past 10 years. And for the past 6, primarily working as an instructional designer, deploying and migrating online classes from on ground to online, which a lot of us are doing that now. But my school did it about 6 years ago, developed their online program, which I was an integral part in doing. And I'm really happy to be here today.
Awesome. So thank you first, Eric, for inviting all of us to be part of this panel. My name is Niatu Bentsi-Enchill. I am the founder and head coach at AvenirCareers.com. And I am a coach that is holistic, and I focus on supporting professionals of color. And when I say holistic, I mean I care about you, the whole person. You're more than just your career. And essentially, I look to integrate the personal and the professional because it all influences where we go in our career development. And as far as my engagement with higher education, I realized in preparing for this that it's been in 3 different phases. Obviously, as a student, undergrad and also graduate school, I earned a master's. Then from there, I became an employee within higher ed. And I was a career advisor and leading an internship program at two-year technical college, and also interned in a career services center. And even prior to that, actually before grad school, one of my earliest jobs was as a recruiter doing executive search for nonprofit and higher ed clients. So I've been a service provider, a student, and an employee of within higher ed.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those introductions. I really feel like we have quite the array of expertise. We have the lived experience of being a student that each of us have had. And then whether it's adjuncting and kind of getting in there with just being the contingent faculty, or the hiring and the recruiting process and the enrollment process, and the evaluation process of employees. I feel like we have, with this panel across the gambit, we can have an authentic discussion, I think, about from the classroom to the boardroom. And so thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And so I'm just going to kick it off with our first question that we have right here. It's, how have you encountered institutional racism in your respective fields, or while navigating academia itself? Let's just go ahead and start with Liz, and then go from there, and I'll just jump off camera here.
Well, yeah, that's a really great question. And I think sometimes there is a misconception. Higher education is usually held up to a very high standard in terms of, it's very liberal. They're very, in terms of the way that we think, we are higher and elevated in terms of our ability to think. A lot of us have masters, and some of us have doctorates. So we're not like the average bear in terms of the way that we think. So I think there tends to be a misconception that higher education is in a bubble, and we're not as prone to some of these issues such as institutional racism. What I've found, honestly, is from working in higher education and nonprofit and in the corporate sector, is the most institutional racism was what I saw and witnessed as an employee and as a student in higher education. Higher education is an area where there tends to be that, and I think we've seen that hubris, that they are beyond reproach. I think sometimes we saw that in the pivot in COVID-19, the pivot to online, where schools are just not receptive to the idea of changing and evolving. And I think we've seen that with our students. Students are becoming more diverse. We have about 30% of students that are students of color. Black students have increased to about 14%, but faculty are 5% of the faculty body is only 5%, and is way out of line with the students that we represent and that we teach. So for me, I think the biggest encounter with institutional racism, from my perspective, is that I don't see myself reflected in higher education. It's very rare that you see Black faculty. If you do see Black faculty, they are contingent, as Eric mentioned. Adjunct faculty are very overrepresented. About 25% of adjuncts are of color, and the percentage of Black adjuncts is smaller than that, but it's still higher than maybe the 2 or 3%, 2% I think, of tenured Black faculty. So we are not represented. If we are represented, we're contingent, which means we don't have a contract, we're not guaranteed to teach a class. That means that contingent faculty are the ones that are teaching those introductory classes. And then the Black students that are not necessarily as prepared because they're coming from underfunded high schools are being taught by somebody that is juggling a full-time job. They're not guaranteed a contract next term. So if you want a mentoring relationship and you're a first generation student like I was, and you're going to that faculty's office hours, that faculty may not even have an office on campus because they work a full-time job somewhere else. So where are you going to get mentoring from? Where are you going to get coaching from? If you're like me, my high school was 90% Black, and I was highly recruited to attend the University of Florida. They came and this was the 90s. Hey, we need to get Black students on campus. Got a full ride, a full scholarship, a full academic minority scholarship. Then got on campus and there was no support system. There was no Black faculty. I posed a question this morning on LinkedIn, how many Black, I'm really curious because I know the stat is out there, but how many Black professors did you have as an undergrad? I had one, and he taught African-American studies, and every Black student that I knew on campus had his class, because we knew that was the only opportunity we were gonna have to have a Black faculty member, someone that looked like us, teaching us. And that's not a good indicator of success, because our Black students need to have Black mentors. They need someone to tell them, like I do on the first day of class. I went to Dillard High School right here on the east side of town, and I know where you're coming from because I've been there. And I didn't have faculty to do that. When I first attended University of Florida, the first thing they would say is, you're probably not going to pass this class, guys. So, hey, work hard, because 50% of you are probably going to fail and you won't get into your core classes because I'm not here to baby you. As a Black student coming from a neighborhood where I didn't even know anyone that had been to college, my parents hadn't been to college, that wasn't very encouraging for me. So we need to look at ways that we can support our Black students. But the first thing that I think needs to be addressed is we don't have Black faculty or Black administrators or Black mentors. So that's been my experience.
Sure. If I could jump in and piggyback off of the numerous, great things you said, I wanted to enter this from the recruiting perspective. And the pipeline issue. And I have two things. I'll get to one of them perhaps later. But who is doing the hiring really matters. If there's 5% representation of Black faculty and staff on campus, what's the reason behind that? And if you look to the executive search committees, that's a large reason why there's a lack of representation and leadership. In my time doing executive search, I can clearly remember that when we had in-person meetings with the search committee, they were majority white. There was a decent mix in terms of male-female balance, but there's very limited and usually no representation of a person of color of any sort, on the search committee that would be ultimately making the hiring decision. And so, what does that mean? That means people hire in their own image, unfortunately. And speaking to where Elizabeth first started, I think liberal racism is one of the most difficult things to displace. It's very difficult for people who believe they're not racist, and we can talk about anti-racism later, but who believe they're not racist, to wrap their mind around the fact that they are engaging in practices, unconsciously or subconsciously that perpetuate racist systems. And so when it comes to the makeup of the search committee, if you don't intentionally begin by creating a diverse search committee, it's quite possible, or more likely, that you'll end up with a non-diverse pick who ends up, attaining that faculty or administrative leadership position. And so we have to take a look at not just the candidate pool, but the people actually doing the hiring. And then if we think about the candidate pool, it was my job at that time to try and build a candidate pool. I had a database of contacts to go through that had been used in previous searches who were noted as good sources. And a lot of those people did happen to be white. And what happened is that white people tend to refer other white people. Why? Because studies have shown that the average white person, 75% of white people have only white circles in terms of their immediate friend groups. 75% of white people don't know a Black person or a person of color as an intimate, close personal friend. And so that just perpetuates a cycle where I go and I try and get recommendations, and the recommendations I'm getting through no fault of my own, and I'm trying to build a diverse pool, tend to be other white people. And so my firm did try and do a pretty good job of trying to present a diverse candidate pool, but then you have a set of decision makers who are not diverse, and the ultimate set of finalists more often not ended up not being diverse, even if a diverse pool is presented to them. And so at multiple steps along the way, there are challenges in terms of diversity actually taking place, even though if it's an expressed desire, the pathways, the pipelines, the connections, unfortunately don't support diverse candidates being put to the forefront and ultimately landing the role because of what the search committees ultimately look like. And so that's one of the big challenges. If you want a diverse faculty and leadership, you need to make very intentional efforts in terms of who's in the room making the decisions and where you're sourcing your candidates from. And those things can be done, they can be changed. It's about the will and the follow through to make it happen, not just words.
So I would say I'd echo similar sentiments. When I think of institutional racism, I think of some things that are subtle, everyday practices. So just adding to the diversity piece, there's an issue with inclusion. So thinking of the history of higher education and the early colonial colleges, a lot of them existed as a way to train typically white men to assume leadership positions in a newly founded country. And then we tried to build on top of this faulty foundation. And then people decided, the powers that be, that we're going to incorporate more people into higher education and try to get more students to come and staff and faculty. But if you look around you and think about the day-to-day practices that happen, the structural piece, what resources are available, whose voices do we highlight, how do we incorporate the needs of different and diverse peoples into what we do from a policy perspective? What do people encounter in the workplace? As a staff member, there have been times like in meetings, like whose voices are highlighted, who's recommended for leadership positions, and then you look around and you see who's in leadership position, and you don't see people that look like you in administration and faculty. So a lot of times it's that day-to-day things that you kind of sometimes can't explain. It's like you wonder, what was this really about? When someone, didn't include me on an email, or talked over me in a meeting, or I didn't get this promotion, or just looking around and observing your environment. So I think that I've experienced those things in higher education.
Okay, thank you for sharing these experiences. I'm just going to ask the next question right over here, and I just want to, and I think this is why I want to just throw up the next question, is because of what you just said. Brittany, it says sometimes it's hard to explain, like, what was that really about? In the conversation that we had previously, I had asked you, like, if you could change something, what would it be? And the response that you gave me was, it's hard to pinpoint what exactly it is. Exactly. And so I think one of the biggest things that we can do is just to make sure, that me as a white person, especially, is just to make sure that we are listening to these stories, so that we can understand that there is a pattern, because there is a pattern that can be seen if we can look for it. And I think that, so this idea of having a pattern goes into the next question that we had actually talked about, is what are the similarities and differences that we've seen for institutional racism in industry versus higher education? And for the purposes of this conversation, we're just going to say that everything that is not higher ed is industry. Like, so if you're like engineering or whatever, I don't know other fields very well. That's industry. And then there's higher ed. So, like, what are the things that are the same, and what are some of the things that have been different? Let's go ahead and let's start, if it's all right with Brittany, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so I think higher education it's a product of our society. So many of those same things that you might face in any organization, it's going to be present in higher education. Some of what we do is very similar to what a company or organization would do, the way that things are structured in the workplace. And so I think that we're influenced by society and vice versa. And I think what Liz kind of mentioned when she was talking previously around how higher education kind of has that mission of, supporting students and, kind of like that, when you think of like a nonprofit, like education is a common good. But at the same time, we're also revenue generating organizations, much like a company or organization. So we sometimes see that there are some similarities when you bring different groups of people in an organization that wasn't necessarily built or designed for them, and trying to not necessarily change the structure or anything that is happening within the organization. And so then you also see instances of symbolic action versus actual real action, which is more difficult to change structural things, policy related things. You see, we care about people, here's a diversity statement, but don't see that incorporated into what the university does on a day-to-day basis. You don't see any major changes. It's almost like a Band-Aid on an open wound. So, I would say that it's similar, but it has differences, obviously, too. But, we're all a product of, growing from the same roots, so to speak. So.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, because I think with higher education, as opposed to corporate and industry, there's actually less of a desire to change, because we're built on tradition. A lot of these, if you go work for a startup, if you work for a corporation, sometimes they've been around 20 years, and that's like, whoa, you guys have been in business for a while. you look at University of Florida or some of these public schools, they've been around since the 1800s. So they're built on hundreds of years of legacy and white male privilege. That's really what it boils down to. So where's their incentive to change? As Brittany, Dr. Robertson said, they are a common good. We look at education now, we're starting to look at it like it's a commodity because we see that, especially with COVID, that they're making business decisions. And obviously we're getting paid with student debt crisis, which is highly more affecting Black students who are more likely to take out student loans. But when we think about education, we typically don't look at it as a business. We look at it as, hey, like healthcare. This is something that is helping people. And I think that also leads to some of the hubris of, we don't have to change because you need to get this. We don't need to defer to you. You're coming to get something you need from us. Just like in healthcare, it's almost like you're at the whim of the institution because they feel as though, I know I saw this as an undergrad, like, hey, you're lucky you could even be here. Like, I don't have to adjust to you. You need to adjust to me. I'm doing you a favor. So there's almost like this idea of, and I think now that everything's happening with COVID, schools are starting to tighten up a little bit. Like, okay, the consumer really is the one that has a big voice here because they're the one that's going to decide if we're in business or not. But typically higher education has not been that way. And higher education is also very hierarchical. So you have people that have a doctorate, people that have a master's degree, and I'm very smart. So there's this level of, if you're Black, then you only have a master's and I'm white and I have a doctorate, who are you to tell me that I need to change? You don't have a doctorate behind your name. And even if you do have a doctorate, then you still have these additional microaggressions that you might not necessarily see in the industry sector because everybody just has a bachelor's degree and it's just like, hey, do you have a good idea that will help us make money? Still, obviously, you see the microaggressions, and as Dr. Robertson very eloquently stated, it's not something you can pinpoint. Somebody didn't call you the N-word. Somebody didn't hang a noose at your desk. So it's not something you could say, look, there's a racist. And that's what people seem to, I think, sometimes misunderstand. Racism is not necessarily when people, I think we talk about people being triggered by talking about race. They're triggered because if you call them a racist, they think a racist is somebody that has a white hood on and is burning a cross. That's not what a racist is. Racism, when we talk about systemic racism, is that you're benefiting from a system that is disproportionately designed to disenfranchise people that don't look like you. So you're taking advantage of that. So I think that's typically what higher education does. They're like, what do you mean? When you're talking about these things, you can't really quantify it. Somebody was talking over me in the meeting. Why were they doing that? And they did that every time I was trying to make my point, or somebody took my idea and ran with it and everyone was like, good job. But when I said it, no one said anything. So it's not something, and then people say, don't be a baby, stop whining. So then you start to question yourself, maybe I need to stop being so sensitive. I was on a conference call and I was talking just like this. I wasn't angry. I was just being very enthusiastic. And somebody, a white lady, said, calm down. Why are you so excited? And I'm like, I'm not excited. We're all just talking and brainstorming. Why are you calling me out for being angry or excited? So some of these things I think we see in higher education, like Dr. Robertson said, are very similar to what you would see in industry. I think in higher education, though, the expectation, I know when I went into higher education, was that higher education isn't like that. You have liberal people, you have people that are creative, you have people that are very educated. They'll recognize if I'm being passed over for a promotion, someone will come to me and say, hey, you know what, let's put you up there. And after 20 years in higher education, I totally have seen that's actually not the case. That if anything, it's more of a possibility that you'll see discrimination because of all the other layers in terms of the hierarchy that are stacked against people of color.
A couple of things came to mind as both of you were talking, making a number of great points. And I just want to seize upon that piece about, higher education as a business and how it's sort of trying to find its footing or evolve its thinking, and how it kind of reveals itself in terms of the decisions that it makes and how systemic racism is very much entrenched. I'm thinking about sports right now, and I'm thinking about COVID. I'm thinking about college sports. I'm thinking about the big sports, football, basketball, and who plays those sports for those colleges, mostly Black athletes. Who makes the money for the schools, mostly Black athletes.
Yes.
And these are unpaid, these are amateurs, right? We can get in the whole nother debate about whether or not they should be paid.
Oh, yeah.
They should be paid. However,
Yes.
they are looking for ways to ensure there is a fall college football season, that there will be a college basketball season. Why? Because millions, if not billions of dollars are at stake collectively if these athletes don't play. And so the business of college sports is something that is at the forefront right now because of COVID. And you are asking majority Black athletes, if we're talking about the big, the most money, the most lucrative sports, are the ones whose bodies will be on the line playing to make money for school that doesn't compensate them for their blood, sweat, and tears, literally as D1 to D3 athletes. And so that's the way that racism can be seen in a very real way today, that the people whose bodies will be willingly sacrificed for the dollar are Black students, athletes who are on campus for the reason of making you guys millions of dollars to fund everything, basically. And so we have to keep in mind that just because you are a liberal institution or academia as a whole institution is considered liberal doesn't mean it can't do incredibly racist things and perpetuate, very racist practices. And so that's something that's happening right now. And even just the whole ongoing fight for athletes to be able to gain compensation for work that they're doing. I have my cousin-in-law, I guess is what it would be. He played Division I baseball at Rutgers, and he told me how miserable it was. He said he hated it. It made him fall out of love with the sport because it was a job. He had 60, 70 plus hours of baseball related activity on top of having to do his classes. He should have been paid in some way, shape, or form. And that's another debate. But this is how, racism can work. This is how it can look in an area that people think is neutral, which is sports. But in higher ed, it's not neutral because of whose bodies are on the line and who gets compensated.
I agree 100%. That's like so real. I went to University of Florida, huge football school, and a lot of the rhetoric, like you said, is, hey, you're getting a free ride here, but you would see athletes that have to put so much work in, plus do school. And then a lot of times, like my daughter's father, she's 21, my college sweetheart, and he dropped out of school. He played 4 years at University of Florida, and he was so strung out and wrung out from all of the practices and workouts and two-a-days and everything else. He didn't even finish school because school was actually his second priority. His job was to be a football player, a linebacker for University of Florida. So I saw that with my own eyes, and people say, stop being a baby, you're here on full scholarship, but their job at school is being an athlete. Their second priority is school.
I remember I remember this shift that I had when I was teaching, because I taught at Clemson University, big football school, right? Go Tigers. And there's some really cool movements that happened on campus that that were talking about these things. And I think this is a really good segment for this question, because like we have to ask this question of just the emotional toll that these, like we're talking specifically about athletes, and just kind of carrying that weight without any compensation is very, very problematic, especially when we're talking about how, like just like Niatu said, that the sports that are bringing in the most money are staffed, employed with students of color, and that's a problem. And so let's go into this other question that we were talking about earlier, is what is the impact of trying to continually improve diversity of the student body without actually addressing the racial climate on campus. As an example, like I said, my past university at Clemson, there was an activist friend of mine, AD Carson, who started a See the Stripes campaign. And it was to say, hey, we should start talking about the racial climate on campus. That was, I think, a year later co-opted by the institution as, look how diverse we are, without saying that they had arrested this person, AD, for a protest to do this very thing. And so, well, like, what has been your experiences that you can share to kind of like help us understand just that that weight and just the pressure of constantly having to be aware of these things. This time let's start with Liz. Go ahead.
I think from the student perspective, it's particularly jarring because as a student myself, coming from a 90% Black high school when I attended undergrad, and you have a very small minority of students that look like you, and they highly recruited you, and they like come to this school, and then when you get there, there's no support system, there's no mentoring. I had a mentoring program, and I went to mentoring, and my mentor was 60, maybe 50-something-year-old white faculty member, very awkward. He was like, "Hi, how are you doing?" And I was just like, "Well, good, there was no conversation. So he reached out to me and I just never responded to his calls because I'm like, I don't have anything in common with him. And these are some of the things that I think when you're talking about recruiting students, you can't just say, oh, we're going to improve the students of color that we have, the Black student population, and then you have nothing to support these students. You don't take into account that some of these students are coming from, obviously, if they're Black or they're other students of color, they may be coming from a K through 12 public school system that isn't adequately funded. So they may not have the same level of preparation as students that are coming from white school districts. I think there's this, and I hate the rhetoric that I hear about, well, you just need to go and work hard. No, because if I went to a predominantly Black school and maybe they didn't have all the ability to have the staffing and have adequate tutoring services and even the same quality of education because of the fact that you're coming from a marginalized area and an area that is predisposed to you're working harder and working extra just to get to the same level as other students that are coming from better funded school districts. And there's this idea that everything's equal. There's a level playing field, even from K through 12. Myself as a faculty member, I see that a lot of the students that are coming from some of these less desirable areas, they're not as prepared. They're not as ready to jump into a Composition 1 class because they don't even know what an essay is, as opposed to somebody that's coming from a better funded school district where they've had all the preparation, they have the proper textbooks, they have the faculty or the teachers that are well invested. You might not necessarily see that in a Black school, and it's not because the teachers don't care, but they're underfunded, they're understaffed, they don't have the same access to textbooks. So there's this is a multi-layered issue, and it actually starts in K through 12, but we see it in higher ed, and we have to address it rather than blaming the student or saying the student's being lazy or the student doesn't care. That's not true. A lot of these students, they are not encouraged. A lot of times they have not seen anyone that has an education past high school. So it's different from a student that is coming from a neighborhood where their parents went to college and they have other mentors, or they have representation even in the media about college. If I'm a Black 18-year-old and I don't have anyone in my family who went to college, and when I turn on the TV or when I look around me in my community, I don't see other people that look like me representing that the ability to even graduate and even go to college, then how am I going to come confidently to get a degree? It's very difficult, and we're asking students to jump over obstacles mentally and emotionally that most of us as adults can't even overcome. So what of an 18-year-old that is going onto a campus and saying, wow, nobody looks like me. Maybe this is not for me. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe I shouldn't have come to college. So we have to put support systems in place. Black students are less likely to graduate. Their retention rates are lower. The graduation rates are lower. And you know what the mainstream will tell you? They're not working hard enough. Maybe they don't want it bad enough. Like they told me when I went to University of Florida, look left, look right. Those people won't be there at graduation. So already as a student, you're like, you know what? If I don't work double hard, I'm not going to graduate. And if you fail a class, it's like, they were right. Maybe I'm just not cut out for college.
Right. And that mental toll is kind of the point that I want to run with from what you were saying. I shared a tweet with the group ahead of this conversation. It's by Dr. Angel Jones, and the tweet reads as follows, quote, "Increasing the number of students of color at your school without also addressing the systemic racism within your institution only increases the number of students of color dealing with the psychological trauma of your racially hostile environment." And so I just want that to sink in a little bit. You're increasing diversity, You're not addressing the racial climate on campus. There's a huge gap here, and you just increase the number of students of color who will be traumatized psychologically by coming to your institution. And so the way that I wanted to operationalize that is with my own experience. I went to a predominantly white institution, Hamilton College in upstate New York. Great school. I had a pretty good time there. However, I remember there being a racist incident on campus almost yearly for the 4 years that I was there. One year, it was a friend of mine who had her Eritrean flag taken down and burned by her neighbor, her roommate's friend who lived next door. There's a controversy over her having an Eritrean flag on her own side of the room, and her roommate retaliated by putting the American flag over their door, which is common property. I had a good friend of mine who's working security for a party called the N-word when he's simply trying to do his job and clear out the event space, following the end of a party. And other things. But almost yearly, it seemed like every spring when, the frost melted from our upstate New York school, the racism came out, bloomed with the flowers. And so, that was the environment that I was in a liberal, well-to-do, prestigious, Northeastern school. And so that climate is something that can be very impactful, and damaging to student of color because of the lack of support. So, Liz has mentioned it so many times, just a lack of support on campus. And so there's a lot of performative diversity that takes place. And I think institutions of higher education are some of the leading culprits of it. They have the right idea in mind in terms of, yes, it is beneficial to all to diversify the student body. But if you don't prepare the environment to welcome diversity and support diversity, then you're doing damage to the diverse students that you bring in for the benefit, of the white students. And so you're in a situation where there are white students who came from all white towns, suburban or rural, who've never really been exposed to students of color. They've never had a Black friend, per what I was speaking about in the beginning. And so all of a sudden, you throw a set of white students who haven't been educated or exposed to people of color in with people of color who maybe come from urban environments where they also may have been, because of how segregated education is in this country to begin with. And then you have this clash of groups who haven't had exposure to one another, and you think they're just going to all get along swimmingly. No, that's not how it's going to work. And so I think there's a failure of leadership within academia to get ahead of the inevitable, clashes that are going to happen with this experiment that you're running. If I'm not a chemist, but if you put certain things together, they're going to react. And so in an institution of higher learning, you should have some level of awareness that these things are going to take place. So what are you going to do about it? How are you going to educate, your students, the faculty, and everyone involved in cultivating the minds of these future members of society in order to help them to understand and shift and better accommodate and get along with one another? And so if the leadership, doesn't take that responsibility, you can't expect the students to necessarily do it on their own. They're there to learn, and you're there to teach. So it's kind of like, do your job, and then maybe things will start to improve.
Yeah, so I would say, so my research focuses on staff in higher education, and I focus on staff for a reason, because when you look at research about race, diversity, equity, inclusion in higher education, it usually focuses on students and faculty, but staff play an important role in the socialization process for students. And students' experiences with staff in the various offices, that can really impact their experience. Like, you go to the financial aid office and you're not really supported in that office, and you don't understand, the process of applying for financial aid, that's going to make students suffer. So it's important to have diversity in all these different departments in higher education and in leadership roles. Having people from diverse backgrounds as decision makers, because that only benefits students. And sometimes from leadership perspective or research perspective, people focus on people that generate revenue, like students bringing revenue, faculty bringing revenue, staff sometimes are viewed as an expense, even though they contribute to that revenue by supporting students, giving them a good experience, recruiting students to come to the university. but yet there's not enough of a focus on what they experience on a day-to-day basis as a staff member, which is why in my article for Inside Higher Ed, when I talked about the performance appraisal process and other types of structural and evaluative processes that don't necessarily take into account different people's experiences, that are not necessarily fair. It's one-sided from leadership, evaluating staff and not the other way around. And usually leaders in higher ed are usually white men. And, then when a staff member experiences hardship, then what happens are either things are taken out on them politically, or they're fired, or they leave the university and then they hire someone new. And there's no real focus on how do we make things better from a staff perspective in higher education and change things structurally. And I also think that for change to happen, there can't just be one office that deals with diversity and inclusion, the multicultural office or the chief diversity officer that has to do things for an entire large organization of thousands of people. One person can't do it alone. Faculty have to be invested, not just adjuncts, but faculty that have voting rights, like those with tenure, leaders in the institution, every single office, financial aid, residential life, recruitment, admissions, advising, everyone has to be invested and committed. And also it's gonna take time. It's not gonna be, it took hundreds of years for us to get here. So it's not gonna be fixed in a second with a Band-Aid. It's gonna take lots of time and investment. And also focusing on different groups in higher education is important as well.
Yes, thank you. I'm gonna throw this up here from Aaron, who is loving the realness of life with kids in the background, because it is life, right? So I feel like this is a really good segue into the question that we have next. This will be the last question that I give to the panel, and we'll kind of we'll make it a little bit of a shorter response. Hopefully, that way we can get some questions from the audience and get some engaging things going here. The panel is set to end at the 50 mark, but if we go over just a few minutes, then I would be comfortable with that as long as the other panelists are well. But we won't go past 12 o'clock. And so here is the next question that we have. And so while we're doing this and discussing, please send us your questions. What is one, and this ties in really well with your article that you wrote, Dr. Robertson, as well as what you were just talking about what specifically can leaders do in this moment. And so what is one thing that every university decision maker needs to be considering in this moment, considering that we have COVID, there's Black Lives Matter happening, there's we're barreling towards the fall semester, but in this moment and talking about this thing, what should university leaders be doing? I'm just going to throw this back over to Brittany, because I feel like you have some good things to say on that.
I would say higher education leaders need to view this as not a moment, but that this has been happening throughout time. And so there shouldn't be a reactive response when things happen. Now we're going to care. Now we're going to do XYZ thing. How can we have a robust and plan moving forward so that as things happen, we already have the mechanisms in place to deal with all these different issues? So it's going to take investment and buy-in, not viewing it as an isolated incident here and there, because then it becomes like, let's just deal with this and then we can move forward and go back to normal. So leaders need to be comfortable with having difficult conversations, with doing hard work, and not just putting quick fixes to big problems. So it's going to take investment. It's going to take this being incorporated to every aspect of higher education, every office, everything we do. And it's going to have to be something that lasts throughout time, because one leader of an institution might care, but then we get another one that doesn't care as much. And then it's like a backwards, forwards kind of thing, and we never really can progress forward. So it takes commitment across time, bringing different people with great ideas, diverse perspectives, having diversity in leadership, people who are making decisions, coming to the table and thinking about how can we change higher ed for the better in a positive way in the long term, and just investing in it. So I think it's just really realizing that this isn't a moment, but this is a larger structural issue that's been building up over time. And hopefully it's not just symbolic change, but change that lasts throughout time and is happening on a structural level.
In terms of change too, I would love to see that diversity and awareness and inclusion and all of these buzzwords that we're seeing, that it's not seen as something radical. Like the ability to change the culture on your campus, make sure that students are supported, make sure that you increase diversity, and make sure that Black and other people of color are represented in leadership and in faculty, and obviously in staff and students. That shouldn't be seen as something like out of the box, like, oh my gosh, like, oh, you want to do that? Are you going to try to have a riot on campus? I don't like the idea, I think, and this is not just in higher education, but in society as a whole, that if you're talking about issues that have to do with your race, then you're being like, what are you doing? What are you trying to do here? You're trying to rabble rouse. Where we, in terms of being people of color and Black people specifically, want to just be considered just as much as everybody else in society needs to be considered, and making sure that our voices are heard, and making sure that we are represented, and making sure that we have adequate and ability to progress within our career. That shouldn't be seen as something radical. That should be seen as just the norm. And I would like it to be seen as addressed as such. Like Dr. Robertson said, there shouldn't just be an office for diversity awareness and multicultural awareness. And then it's just like, this is just something performative, where this is just an initiative that we're going to have. That should just be normal life. Like people of color and Black people specifically being shown respect, having opportunity, being able to progress in their career, that should come automatically. It shouldn't be something that we have to hit the streets and protest about, have panels about and discuss, because it's not normal that in institutions, there's such a small percentage of leadership that are Black, such a small percentage of faculty are Black, and students of color and Black students are not graduating. Somebody should be looking at that and saying, something's not right here. But it tends to be something, I think, that we talked about initially, where there's just a lack of awareness and there's a lack of consideration about it. People just don't care. And the stats that were thrown out in the beginning in terms of people not having Black friends. I posed this idea to somebody, and I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of some of the other marginalized groups that have been able to make some really big changes in this country, such as the LGBTQ community and women being able to really assert their rights. But all of us have a mother, all of us have a sister. Many of us, myself included, have gay and bisexual and trans people in their family, and we don't want to see them discriminated against. But do you have a Black friend? Do you have a Black family member? And I feel like there's some empathy that also needs to be included in, and people need to look outside their circle and be intentional in terms of, if I don't have a Black friend, then I really am, why is that? I ask people that question all the time. Why don't you have any Black friends? Because I know plenty of white people, and I interact with white people all the time, but there are many people that are in the dominant culture that will flat out tell you, I don't have any Black friends. That's curious to me. And I would love to see people being a little bit more intentional about the idea that Black people are not other. We're not aliens. We need to be incorporated. And that, when I think there's been a lot of backlash about Black is King, and people saying, well, why are people saying Black is King? Why are people saying Black Lives Matter? Because everything in our society around us by default is White Lives Matter. Everything by default is white is king. So we have to assert ourselves and try to enter the community and enter the conversation. And there shouldn't be a backlash about that, because we deserve to be represented. We deserve to have promotions. We deserve to be a good portion of the work life and the balance and the community and education just as much as everybody else. But when you assert yourself, people say you're trying to do a riot or have a protest, and that's not true. We just want to be considered and make sure that our rights are equitable, just like everybody else's rights.
Right. So much there. I want to jump a little bit on that piece about buzzwords, and I think that higher education can normalize discussing race. And, you know, speaking to what both Dr. Robertson and you, Liz, were both saying in terms of it needs to be something that is institution-wide and can't and should not be carried, you know, by one person or one office. And so education is what higher ed does, so do it. And so what I'm thinking about specifically is a class that I took my freshman year of college at Hamilton, which was called Narratives of Difference. This is a class that I think should have been mandatory for everyone in that school coming in, and I think it should honestly be replicated across the entire academic, industry. What this class was having freshman students, 18 years old, fresh out the box, encountering directly the isms of this world, the isms of America. So I'm reading, Mark Doty, I'm reading Beverly Tatum, I'm reading authors I had no clue about, coming in as a wide-eyed freshman, and having to encounter what's my relationship to racism as I'm African, I'm an immigrant, I'm Ghanaian, but I grew up here. And so I have all these things, even just within me and my own lived experience, that I have to wrestle with. Encountering homophobia for the first time and coming to understand what that is and what that looks like. Understand Latinx discrimination, and so many other narratives of difference. We discussed ableism in that class. And so I was confronted as a freshman with the isms of society, and forced to, well, not forced, but encouraged and supported and guided in writing and examining and interrogating these issues that I was going to face on my campus and in the outside world. And so, institutions have the power. They create curriculum. They create requirements for graduation. They can mandate that a certain class has to be taken by every single member of the matriculating student in order to graduate. And so institutions of higher education should educate around racism and sexism and misogyny and homophobia and all the ills of this world. They have the power to do that and should be taking the lead in doing that, because that's your job. And so if they would simply do their job, then we would be producing more students who will become working adults, who will have had the opportunity in this more protective environment to wrestle with these issues, find out and learn new things from one another, and then go into the real world, hopefully as more enlightened individuals. That's the job of higher education again, to contribute to the workforce into the world with a basis of knowledge that will be hopefully transformative. So institutions should create classes like that. I think they should mandate them. And then finally, leaders should be prepared to be held to a higher standard. I think that everyone on this call who's currently job searching should be prepared to ask, how did you treat your employees during COVID? How did you prioritize your employees during this time? And also, how did you support your Black employees during this this renewed fire of racial injustice? Ask those two questions, all of you who are out there listening, looking for new jobs, and leaders should be prepared to have a good answer for that. That means taking real action from this day forward to have good answers ready when they get asked those questions.
I think that's really, really, really important. The two things that I think that we can end on with this idea that, number one, people have to ask questions. Like, if you're not asking questions, that's part of the problem. And it can't be just Black people asking questions. Like, it needs to be like, we have allies and advocates that are also asking these questions. And to be able to speak together and doing that. And we have to be able to figure out a way that people can be held accountable. And one of the conversations that I was having with Dr. Robertson in preparing for this was the idea that there is no incentive to make anything better. There's no way, like, if all of our stories or all of your stories are anecdotal, then it's just dismissed as anecdotal. But if we can come together and to collect these stories and to bring them together to show that there is a pattern that is very real, that was often intentionally designed and sometimes not intentionally designed, but still has very harsh reality and impact. We have to be asking questions always. I love what Niatu said. Like, education is what education does. So let's just do it. We have we'll just throw this out here. Just a couple more things from some of our audience, that these are loaded, important questions that you're right, that we should be definitely asking those questions. We have data with the access to power. We are ethically bound to question the structure and the societies in which they can move comfortably. For me, data's a good friend of mine. And that's what I've learned in my space, that I need to be able to step back and ask those questions, because I can move comfortably. And so, and I think it was Liz who said that people need to get comfortable with, like leaders need to get comfortable with hard work. Or I can't, like, it's just, I love that. So thank you so much, each one of you, for sharing your story, sharing your time. I appreciate getting to know each one of you through this process, and being able to learn more and to ask questions, and to figure out ways that I can myself just be a better person. I'm going to say thank yous. We're going to wave goodbye. I'm going to just wrap up the thing and let people know about some of the other events. Thank you so much for coming. Let's give them just a huge round of applause. Like, everybody can like thumbs up. Yay. All right. In a very real way. Thank you. I love you. Thank you for being here. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Thanks for having me. Bye. Thanks for coming.
Coming to this platform, and learning how to engage with people has been one of the best experiences that I've ever had in my life. There are amazing people in the world like Brittany and Liz and Yatu, that if you approach them in sincerity and with authenticity, they're going to talk to you, and just you can form just some of the coolest relationships with people. And that's what we need right now, is to make sure that we're doing that we're connecting with people as often as we can, and who are different from us. That's what we need to do, and we need to just take a step back and listen. So thank you so much for everybody. We have some more conference. We have right now at 12 o'clock, we have some breakout sessions. One, crafting the targeted job search strategy from Heather, a LinkedIn makeover, positioning yourself for global opportunities from Funmi, who's joining us from Nigeria. And then also the 4 phases of career transition with Lisa and Jackie. So be sure, if you haven't signed up for those, to go sign up. There should be some really cool stuff. These are some great resources to help you find some jobs. Thank you so much. And we'll see you again at 1 o'clock for the Educators Exodus to Industry. What do we do when it's time to leave? Thanks.